Hello, everybody. We're right on time. I'm gonna kick off in the interest of efficiency. So welcome to everybody for joining us today for the second session of the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research's Winter Seminar Series. And thanks for making time for this event in your busy schedule, or if you're in New South Wales, you're probably just trying to find things to do in lockdown. So today's theme is unexpected wins in justice system reforms. First up, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we all meet on. For me, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, but I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia from wherever you're joining us, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also would like to extend that welcome to First Nations colleagues who are joining us on the call today. Before we get started on presentations, I just want to let you know that we'll be recording this session and posting a link to our website in the coming days. And we also have time for questions after each speaker. We've learned that it works better if you just put your questions into the Q&A just ahead of the completion of the session, and then we can get to them. But if you don't have time to get your question answered, definitely shoot us an email and we'll get back to you directly. So as I said, our topic for today, unexpected wins in court reform. You'll be hearing the results of 2 criminal justice evaluations that have achieved or have the power to achieve significant changes in the efficient operation of the criminal justice system. So our first speaker is Malindi Sayle. She's the Director of Modelling and Insights here at Boxar and generally criminal justice soothsayer. Anyone that knows Malindi knows that she actually has a superpower, and luckily for us at Boxar, that superpower is a sixth sense for the operation of the justice system. So we're really lucky to have her share her understandings here today. So you will have seen the title of this presentation, and shout out to you all for coming in spite of that pretty cryptic title. Internally, that reform is called the equally unimpressive table reforms, which definitely by admission make it a hard sell in terms of audience engagement. But you absolutely will not regret making time for this, as I can hand on heart say that this reform is possibly the greatest criminal justice reform you've never heard of. And last of all for me, I just want to acknowledge the wonderful Claire Ringland at Boxar who did the work behind the evaluation. But enough from me, over to you, Malindi.
Thanks, Jackie, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity today to talk to you about, as Jackie said, table offence reform is something you've never probably heard of. It is actually one of my favourite reforms because I'm a kind of a person that has favourite reforms, and I'm very excited about this opportunity to talk to you about how this reform came about, what it was doing, and share the outcome of the evaluation that, as Jackie said, Claire Ringland, our colleagues, has completed in Boxar. My presentation today will have roughly 4 sections. At the first point, I'll talk you through a little bit about the criminal courts in New South Wales, what that looks like. We'll then talk a little bit about district court and the pressures that we were experiencing then. I'll then talk to you about the table offence reform. What is table? What the study is, and some of the headline measures. Then we talk about what the study found, and finally, what the implication of that study and the finding is for the wider criminal justice system. So I hope this will be a good ride, and I'll just get the slides up. Now, if the slide is already up, let me know if it is. Cool, great, the slide's up. Okay, so let's just get this party started. And as I said, the title's a bit cryptic, and I'll get to you as to why drugs are involved in all of this very, very shortly. So hold on there and we'll get this started. Okay, so first, this slide is just a bit of a summary of the criminal courts in New South Wales. On the left side, there's some case laws. On the right side, is the different types of crime that each courts deal with in this sort of a split. So at the bottom, there's a local court. Local court's the powerhouse of the New South Wales criminal justice system. It finalises around 130,000 matters a year. And in terms of crime types, you can see on the left, it does lots of different things. But in terms of volume, traffic is the biggest one. and then they do some other things. At the top is the Supreme Court, which deals about 100 matters, excluding appeals each year. And you can sort of see they're pretty big on violence, which would make sense, and a lot of those involve homicide judges. In the middle is the District Court, which is where the bulk of the serious matters go, and it's also the focus of the presentation today. And in terms of the crime type they deal with, they're looking at serious violence, including sexual assault, and also lots of drug matters, which will become key later. So the other piece of puzzle for this reform is what was happening to the District Court quite a number of years back. So in terms of the District Court, so it's in the middle of that criminal triangle. For matters to go to the District Court, it has to come through the local court first in a process called committal. So matters committed from the local court to the District Court is the inflow. And on the left-hand side chart at the bottom, the colourful one, that's the type of the matters that were committed to the higher courts, and the different colours shows your offence type. You can sort of see the total slope is quite high. So that sees quite a significant growth over those 5 years that we're currently looking at. And you can also see there's two key crime types that I've pointed out in terms of numbers. So one is drugs. Drugs went up quite a bit, as you can see. And this is an issue because of the sheer increase in volume. So between those 5 years, drug matters committed to High Court went up by 70%, which is quite a lot. At the bottom is your violence, specifically sexual assault. Sexual assault is an issue in terms of demand for the higher courts because they're complex on average because of the nature of the offences, and they quite often go to trials. And trial is the single most sort of resource-consuming task in the District Court, and also because of the increase in volume during this time. So it went up by about 42% in those 5 years, which combined with the fact that they're quite serious, it's quite a significant pressure on demand. So on the right-hand side, you see a chart that has what we call time to justice, or time to finalisation from charge, so when the person gets arrested, to matters finalised in the District Court. And you can see a steady increase of about 100 days during those 5 years. So that's almost a 25% blowout in time to justice or court delay, which is of significant concern for those involved in the justice system. So in 2018, to address this District Court delay problem, essentially, and the demand pressure, a number of reforms were implemented to combat this. And table offence reform I talk about today is one of those things. And you can sort of see why drugs might be a bit of a focus because of this increase. Okay, so I have a table to explain a table offence reform. It is ironic, but please stay with me because there's quite a lot happening over here. So what is a table offence and why does it matter? In New South Wales, criminal charges are classified roughly into 4 categories, and that's the sort of what's included in this particular table. At the most serious are strictly indictable offences. Those are matters that have to be dealt with, are very serious and have to be dealt with Supreme Court or District Court. At the bottom, there's summary offences, and those are relatively trivial matters or less complex matters that always gets dealt with the local court. So you're talking, shoplifting, someone driving offences, things like that. In the middle is these offences called table offences. The reason why they're called table is because there's actually physically a table at the back of Criminal Procedures Act that lists all these offences. And these offences can be essentially heard either at the higher or lower court, depending on what happens with prosecution. So table 1, so that's the more serious types of table, that could be heard, that could be elected to be heard in the higher court by prosecution or defence, so either the ODPP or the defendant. Table 2 is the less serious of the tables, and those matters could be elected to be heard in the higher court by prosecution. So what happens is that when these matters, table offences get charged, the matters come through the police and then to ODPP, and they get to make a decision whether or not they want to hear the matter as a higher court on indictment or in a local as a summary matter. So it kind of goes either ways. It makes a difference. The pathways make a difference because there's quite a different processes in court between local and higher courts. So cases dealt with summarily in local court are heard by magistrates sitting alone. They're relatively less complex. They're quite fast in terms of finalisations. Matters elected offences and strictly indictable cases that commence in local court but are then committed to the higher court, so district and Supreme Court. Once they enter the higher court, district court, they are presided by a judge. And also, if the person pleads not guilty, it will go to a trial in front of a jury and a judge. So you can sort of see that will be a much more involved process, quite effort intensive, and it also takes much longer to finalise because of those procedural steps that you have in between. Where the court matter is heard also affects the maximum penalty the court can impose, because in the local court there's a cap on magistrates' power about sentencing. And so in terms of imprisonment, magistrate is constrained by 2 years of max for single offence or 5 years for combined offence, whereas in the district court there is no such constraint. So what happened? The election decision that prosecution makes for table offences make a difference, because a same offence can have quite a different pathways in terms of time to justice and potentially penalty. If you look at the volumes, though, you can sort of see on sort of the right-hand side of the table, a vast majority of table offence matters are dealt with in the local court. So for table 1, the more serious one, about 95% are dealt with in local court, and for table 2, 99.7% are dealt with in the local court. So that's really, look, essentially if matters are on table, the chances are they'll stay in the local court, apart from those exceptional circumstances where prosecution's looking at a sentence of longer than 2 years. There's other factors that make it more serious. That's a one take higher court. Okay, so that's hopefully just bit of a story coming up towards what the table offence reform is. The table offence reform is where we reclassify a strictly indictable offence that has to be heard in the district court for these ones, to move it to the table so it could be heard either in the local or the district court, depending. So this is an efficiency reform in the sense of for matters that move from the strictly indictable pathway to the local court summary pathway, it's going to be much faster for it to be finalised. In terms of resources, it's a lot less intensive. So it creates, and also the spared capacity for district court, if these matters, some of these matters are removed, can then be used for more serious offences like sexual assault. And so that is how that sort of reform works. In terms of, so there were table offences reform, there's been sort of a number of tranches, as it were. So there was a tranche 1 that was implemented quite early in the piece at the end of 2016, which impacted a small number of break and enter offences. Then we had a tranche 2.1 and 2.2 because they were implemented at a slightly different time, but we're looking at it together today, where firstly there was a few procedure crime and justice procedure offence. And then in tranche 2, we had a robbery offence, and most importantly, a drug supply offence that was moved from strictly indictable to table. You might wonder why these offences were chosen, and if they were already heard in the district court, why would you move it to the local court? These offences were selected because pre-reform, around 90% of them was receiving penalties that fell within the local court jurisdiction. So that's 2 years imprisonment or less. So it meant that for most of these offences, in fact, vast majority of them, being in the local court wouldn't have created a sort of a ceiling to the sentence that the magistrate can impose. It would have been quite similar in terms of the scope. And for those matters where the prosecution or police would like to see a higher sentence, the matter still could be elected as a table offence to be taken out to the district court. So this meant that instead of being absolutely has to be going to the district court, there's some choice by the prosecution agency whether or not to take these matters to higher court. And you can sort of see in terms of drug supply offences, I've added a bit of a note to sort of say these were drug supply offences that were more than indictable quantity. And this meant about 5 grams for cocaine, heroin or ice, or 1.25 grams for MDMA, which is 5 or 6 pills. So theoretically, someone that had about 8 pills in their possession could have been taken to the higher court because it's strictly indictable. It has to be dealt with in the higher court and face the jury if they pleaded not guilty. And that contrasts with sort of some of the other more serious matters in the higher court, like sexual assaults, where you really want to be using those jury times. So the idea was that for these less complex district court matters, take them out and make all of the courts efficient at the same time. Claire Ringland, who did this evaluation for the tranche 2 that we're talking about today, also did an evaluation of tranche 1 reform, so that's your break and enter offences. That outcome evaluation found that by reclassifying these break and enter offences, around 85% of eligible offences were moved from the district to local court. Time to justice went down from 404 to 206 days, so that's kind of almost half. And then what we found, which we weren't expecting, is that it also reduced the likelihood of prison penalties for those offences that was moved from the higher local court, particularly for those longer than 12 months. So at this particular evaluation is essentially a replication of that first study, but looking at the tranche 2 offences, so those offences in the non-grey section. And about 80% of the volume of matters looked at was drug offences. So really the story about this table offence for tranche 2 is the story of drug supply offences and it moving from the higher to the local court. So this is just a summary of what the current study looked at in terms of outcomes. So as I said, did eligible cases move from district to local court? Did it reduce time from charge to finalisation? And did it impact prison penalties? So there's the same question that was asked in the first one. We're looking at it again. And the study sample was charges of interest 18 months before and after the introduction of reform. So we're looking at about 2016 to 18, and then mid 2018 to 2019 is the 2 periods being compared. There was also an in-depth analysis done for the drug supply charges because there was enough volume, specifically looking at sentencing outcomes, where we also try to control for a number of things that have an independent influence on the sentencing outcome. So things like the defendant's characteristics, the criminal history, what did they plead guilty, not guilty, were they in remand, that kind of things. And also if the matters are impacted by the community-based sentencing reform that was introduced in 2018, which could also have had an impact on the sentencing outcome independent of the stable offence reform. So that is a bit more robust way to compare penalties before and after. Okay, so what did we find? Okay, this slide is hectic, but bear with me. First, did cases move from district court to local court? It sure did, and quite a bit did. So in terms of total, there were 1,800 post-reform matters in the sample that Claire looked at. As I said before, over 18% of these matters involve supply of drugs. So that's the big offence type that's been moved. And we found that about 78.9% of the matters post-reform were finalised in the local court. So quite a bit. So what 4 in 5 offences essentially were moving from district to local court. The chart below is a bit of a trying to explain that. So you can sort of see in the pre-reform, there's about 1,500 charges. And then so there's about 1,400 sentence matters, actual sentence matters, which moved to 370 in post-reform district court. There was 92 trials pre-reform, which goes to 11 trials post-reform. And then the difference between those two numbers are the avoided sentence and avoided trials. So a bit over 1,000 avoided sentence in the high district court and about 80 avoided trials as well. The offset of this that we get more work in the local court because we moved it. And so in the local court, we see a bit over 1,000 sentences being added and about 320 defendant hearings added as a result of these moves. So you can sort of see there's definitely been quite a direct transfer for these matters. Second question, were reform matters finalised faster? Again, the answer is an emphatic yes by more than 6 months. So the chart on the left at the bottom is comparing pre and post reform in terms of median time to justice. You can see there's quite a bit of difference by almost 200 days between those two numbers. And these largely again represent the drug matters because it's the biggest sample. And then on the right-hand side also, you can sort of see the proportion of matters that were finalised within 1 year. It goes from about 31% to 30 or close to 76%. So significant improvement to time to justice for these matters. Most of the improvement came from matters being dealt with in local court instead of district court. So there's the pathway switch, but there was also a small increase in matters that were finalised in district court as well. So it's a bit of a combined effort, but mostly it's really moving it to a faster jurisdiction is the benefit that you get from this reform. The third question is, did the reform impact prison penalties? And again, the answer is yes. And for drug charges, when we did that in-depth analysis, that change happened even after we adjusted for a range of factors that I mentioned before. So interestingly, of those matters found guilty of the reform-related charges, the same proportion of matters ended up with an imprisonment order. So people who were getting prison were still getting prison, or I guess proportion of matters. but what was different was the length of sentence. So in terms of proportion of matters that got a minimum or non-parole term of more than 12 months, pre-reform we were looking at about 17%, post-reform we're looking at about 9%. And so there's quite a bit of difference in terms of lengths. And this, the significant difference between pre and post sentence lengths, so 12 months less or more, remain significant even after those range of factors were included in the analysis, including like case history, number of offences, and also whether or not the reform was impacted by the community-based sentencing reform. So the findings there seems quite robust. So the last bit is, so what does this all mean? So let me tell you about what I think about that. So in summary, the study found, essentially replicated the first study. We found that matters were moved from district court to local court, reducing pressures on district court by quite a few numbers of matters. It reduced court delay, particularly for those matters affected. It also reduced the likelihood of longer prison penalties. Again, that was the same as we found previously. There is still, however, an offsetting impact on the local court caseload because we moved all those matters to local court, which I'll get to you in 1 second. There is also some limitation of studies that we should point out. There is some inherent difference between the processes between district and local court. Matters that go up to district court gets a lot more checks and balances, and they also go through a lot more of a plea negotiation type and things. So that means that sometimes charges get withdrawn or get switched around. And so we don't get, it's not exactly the same, the process between those two things. Claire did look at this quite extensively in tranche 1 of the reform, looking at sort of if you can control those things. Overall, it seems that the impact still stands. If you look at this kind of impact overall from not just looking at the samples of the table offence reform, but kind of the wider offence group. So I think we're quite comfortable the impact is still there, but it's definitely something we have to acknowledge that it's the two things is not exactly comparable overall. The other thing also very important is that the time this reform was implemented was a time of change in the justice system. Lots of reforms were implemented at the same time. So early appropriate guilty plea reform was something that was implemented during the same time, and that the focus of that reform was to offer some sentencing discount for early pleas. So the idea is that could have also impacted the sentencing outcome for matters going to the higher court if those incentives were in play for these matters. Claire didn't find there was any difference in sentencing outcome for district court matters when compared. The change was really coming from matters moving from the district to local court. Again, community-based sentencing reform is something I mentioned before. That also happened at the same time. When we controlled for that for drug offences, it didn't have an impact overall. Oh, well, it didn't change the significance, sorry. So we think it's been controlled for, but it's something, if there's some way we haven't accounted for that, then it's obviously a bit hard to completely control. COVID-19 pandemic, which messes all of our time series. There probably isn't a huge amount of impact for this one, we think, because we looked at charges that were finalised quite like matters charged by end of 2019, and they had some time to get through the process, but there is some chance that it's been impacted a little bit, particularly for higher court matters that took a while to get finalised. So we can't completely rule out that there's some impact there in that one. So those are all sort of completely valid limitations. Okay, more slides. So this is a bit, what does this actually mean in terms of the court's caseload? So I mentioned before that matter moved from higher court to lower court. This adds volume to the local court, obviously creating pressure. What does that mean? In terms of the two courts, though, there's very different numbers of just baseline operation, which is kind of hard to get your head across, but here it is. So on the bottom right is district court. So district court on average finalizes about 3,500 trial. 3,500 sentences matter a year, and the avoided sentences, if we make it sort of an annual number, is about 685 or so. So that means that it's equivalent of removing about 20% of district court sentences, the impact of this table offence reform. For trials, it's equivalent to removing about 7% of the workload. These kind of drug matters in particular were pretty like the least complex of the district court, so they're not so probably they're less complex than average. So the workload it reduces is probably less than these proportions, but certainly in terms of volume, it's quite significant. It's like you can see them in pretty much all of the stats as a massive drop. What does this mean for the local court? In terms of local court, it is absolutely an extra volume, but then the proportion is just much, much smaller. So these same numbers are adding essentially, well, this is a slightly more higher numbers because we added more to the local court. It's adding 1% to local court sentence volumes in terms of annual activity, also adding about 1% to the defended hearing activity. So for local court, these are probably more complex on average. So it probably adds a bit more workload than these percentage suggests. But again, in terms of volume, it's nowhere near the same compared to the district court. The other thing is that these matters, if they were to be going to the district court, they had to go through the committal process before the reform, but now they don't anymore because they're not getting committed to the higher court. So there's also some efficiency gains by avoiding committals, and that I estimate about 15% of volumes in terms of committals being avoided because of this reform. So local court absolutely has more work, but it's a bit of an offset of these two, drop in committals and increase in sentence and defended hearings is where we land. My last slide is to do with, okay, so prison, how about it? So we can actually see sort of what we think has happened to this in terms of prison impact from a very high level. So at the bottom, this is New South Wales prison population, and the grey one is all other offences scale on the left-hand side. The blue line is drug offences, so this is all drug offences scale on the right-hand side. So you can, and sort of that's the start, the June 2018 is where sort of the impact starts. And you can sort of see, if you compare those two lines, that the grey line is reasonably stable, if not a bit up, but you see a bit of a dip in the drug offences. And so if you compare the growth rate pre-reform 18 months, all other offences went up by 7%, whereas drug offences went up by 5%. Post-reform, all other offences increased by 2%. The growth rate is probably a bit lower because of the sentencing reform, but drug offences decreased by 10%. So it's a bit of it's a drop. So not all of that drop will be or change will be coming from table offences reform, because as I said, there's other reforms in play. But I think it will be fair to say that the table offence reform contributed to drop of people in prison for drug offences during this time. And that is my presentation.
Thanks, Malindi. That's fantastic. So we do have a number of questions. So one is, I think it's on slide 15, is why there are now more defended hearings in the local court than there are trials saved in the higher courts?
It is an excellent question. I have some guesses, which I'll tell you about. I can't prove it. So there's a couple of things. The first thing is that these offence type, if you can remember that the first matters committed to the higher court initially, there was an upwards projection of matters going up. So these offence type was already, particularly for drugs and also things like robbery, there's been an increase in legal action, which kind of creates upwards pressure on the inflow. The other thing is that in terms of time to finalise, local court matters are finalised faster than district court matters. And we have a cap on the time matters could be finalised to be able to include in the sample. Oh. So it might have been that there's some delay and we're not capturing all of the district court matters that to be included. So that might be so those two, I think, would probably be my main explanation. Although that is my opinion, so I can't actually prove it.
Great. So I guess another question is whether why were these offences in the high courts strictly indictable in the first place, and are there other candidates to transition to the local court in a similar way?
That is absolutely an excellent question. I am not sure why it is we're in the high court in the first place. I think there was, particularly for drugs, my understanding is that there was quite a bit of an increase over time, particularly around matters that were being deemed supply. So there's a thing in drug called, if you have a certain amount of drugs with you, it's assumed that you were there to supply it, and you have to prove otherwise if you're the defendant. And there was a huge amount of increase in that. So it might have been that less serious matters were getting captured more and more in the strictly indictable provision, because as I said, the rate, if there was an increase in use of MDMA, there might have been just sort of just increase in that matters that get captured. In terms of what we might have as other candidates, I think the low-hanging fruit is already in there. So really the drug supply was the biggest one by far. And the other ones, there are some volume, but I don't think there's anything quite as straightforward in terms of what's remaining. But that's something that we would like to keep an eye on in terms of further efficiency that could be made.
Great, thanks, Malindi. I think that's it for time. But if there's anyone in the call who runs a criminal justice system somewhere, I really recommend that you implement a reform like this, because it's going to save you money, which is a big motivator in justice. Thanks, Malindi. So our next presenter is Min-Taec Kim, a senior analyst at Boxer. So Min-Taec also has a superpower, but his superpower is being the runner-up in criteria competitions. So we're not going to see that today, unfortunately. So Min-Taec's actually not presenting an evaluation, but his results are really relevant in light of changes taking place in courts in New South Wales and elsewhere. So over many years, criminal courts have moved towards hearing more court matters by audiovisual link rather than in person, where it's beamed into court from prison by video. So this is really appealing to justice agencies because they can avoid the cost, risk and effort of transporting prisoners. And in New South Wales, for example, weekend bail courts are held by AVL, and particularly during COVID court interruptions, all matters were really moved towards to AVL. I guess we can expect this to kind of further increase in the future. But what we've never known is how that impacts decisions that are made by the courts, and whether there's any disadvantage to defendants for appearing by AVL. And this is the gap that Min-Taec's work fills. So over to Min-Taec to tell us to the answer to the question that's on everybody's lips, I know.
Thanks, Jackie. Yeah, so today I'm going to walk through this this work I've done on the impact of audiovisual link on being granted bail. So the report's been out since February. So if people have been wondering about the answer, it's been sitting on our website this whole time. But just want to thank everyone for tuning in. I know it's really beautiful outside my window, so even more grateful that people are kind of sticking around and listening to me talk about audiovisual link. So in this presentation, I'm just going to walk through who uses audiovisual link and what is that like, and why it matters at all that defendants are appearing via audiovisual link, how we studied the impact of audiovisual link quite specifically on the bail outcomes, and what we found. And at the end, I'll kind of try and wrap up like what we should take away and what we shouldn't kind of take away from this research. So as Jackie kind of briefly mentioned, AVL usage has been on the rise, both kind of pre and post pandemic. So legal aid has been using it more and more to deliver services. It increased by approximately 30% in the last 5 years. And we've had kind of a similar kind of huge increase in the usage of audiovisual link for other matters, and in particular for bail hearings. So we had kind of just under 19,000 cases having their first bail hearing via audiovisual link in the last couple of years, just before the pandemic started. And then since the pandemic started, hearings in the local and high courts have been seen by audiovisual link by default. So basically, unless there's a really good reason to see it in person. People have been wondering about what impact that has on kind of courtroom decisions. It's probably worth noting here that I don't cover how my results generalize to the kind of post-pandemic setting. You know, there's been a lot of things happening simultaneously, making that really difficult. I started working on this, well over a year ago now, and at that time, the question was primarily how was it affecting court decisions in that pre-pandemic period. So that's kind of what I'm going to focus on today. It's a little funny trying to explain what audiovisual link is while we all sit on this video call together, but I thought maybe just some photos of what it looks like kind of in practice might be more helpful. So here's the audiovisual link process from the perspective of the courtroom, helpfully provided by the UTS Design Innovation Research Centre. And so you can see that, as you'd expect, there's a big screen. The court can see the defendant. There are those two cameras mounted on top there, so the defendant can see into the courtroom. And as I'm sure many of you are familiar now, there are, some limitations to what it's like to be on the other side of that experience, and have everybody in the room be able to kind of interact with each other as normal, and then for you to kind of be behind the screen. So the reason that this might affect court outcomes is that it kind of has this twofold impact on the interaction during the hearing for both the magistrate and for the defendant. So on one hand, there's this kind of direct effect on the way that the court interacts with the defendant. The defendant is now kind of, people have speculated, may be dehumanized, but it certainly changes the framing of the defendant. It kind of takes them out of the courtroom and places them into the screen. And because of the way that the technology works, who knows what the lighting is like or what the sound is like, it can really change the way that the defendant is presented. On the other side of the interaction, this obviously kind of has a pretty big impact on the experience of the defendant with the justice system. So it really adds this barrier to engagement. In one particular kind of horrifying case study, a person reported that the magistrate had them on mute for their entire hearing. So they were trying to say stuff, but they weren't able to be heard because they were on mute. And when the magistrate kind of sheepishly took them off mute towards the end of the hearing, that he had already been granted bail. So that was kind of the end of the experience. Some defendants have also reported a lack of privacy or comfort, which can make it difficult to kind of engage with services if you feel like other people can hear. And people have speculated that they may represent themselves differently as a consequence. So there's this kind of twofold effect. There's this direct effect that the magistrates experience viewing the defendant, and then again, the defendant may behave differently, which may cause the magistrate to kind of make a different decision than they otherwise would. Just some research by others who have, had the chance to go and visit these facilities firsthand, noting that these facilities, can be very small, can lack basic amenities. They can have chronic technical issues, which can really reduce the understanding and kind of cause stress. With this technology, audio can be out of sync. It can be quite alienating. I just want to note here that it seems like when trying to understand audiovisual link, there's a need to kind of differentiate between what is inherent to the technology and what cannot be changed, and things that are kind of implementation issues that kind of should and can be fixed by improving the implementation of the technology. So what has been kind of driving the increase in audiovisual link usage in courts? Jackie kind of touched on it slightly, but there is a pretty obvious and sizable benefit to audiovisual link for the justice system. So this is a study by Neil Donnelly, one of my co-workers here at Boxer, estimating exactly how much money does audiovisual link save if you implement it at courts. So what he found was that having these AVL facilities implemented reduces in-person appearances by somewhere between 55 and 65%, which saved in the first 3 years of implementation just under $500,000, so $460,000. Which is largely due to the fact that they don't have to go back and forth from the courtroom, from the custodial facility. So this just captures the benefits of transport and security costs. It doesn't capture the benefit from other things like improving access to services in courts. Particularly, it may speed up how quickly they can be seen in remote areas. And also there are benefits to defendants in avoiding transport and security as well. It can be quite a long trip and quite a stressful trip. So there are these kind of 4 broad ways that audiovisual link could impact the experience for defendants and for the justice system for bail hearings. So there's kind of the experience of defendants and this feeling of procedural, or the reality of procedural justice of being seen by audiovisual link, and whether that translates into court outcomes is kind of the question that I'm going to look at in this study. the findings of this research will then have kind of flow-on impacts on the whole of government costs, because if more people are denied bail, or if court outcomes shift in some other way, this can impact costs through that mechanism as well. And if there is no such impact, then you've got these logistical and transport costs that are going to reduce costs for whole of government. So, for this study, we look really narrowly, we look really specifically at the impact of appearing via audiovisual link on being granted bail. So on the right-hand side there, I've just put up a chart so you can see the kinds of offences that we're dealing with. Quite a lot of breach of violence orders, assault charges, stalking charges, breaches of bond, unlawful entry, quite a lot of things, but that's kind of what it looks like. And as I mentioned earlier, about a third are seen via audiovisual link. We only look at defendants who have already been refused bail by police, because they're the ones who are then considered to be seen by a court for bail. And each observation is a first bail hearing, which means that people can and do appear multiple times in the data, because they can have a first bail hearing multiple times for different offences. Overall, our data has 25,926 hearings across 18,653 individuals. So it's a pretty big data set. We concentrate predominantly on disadvantage. You'll notice that in the results section, I'll kind of hammer home again and again what effect this has had on disadvantaging the defendant. The reason that we focus on that, other than kind of generally being more concerned with people being denied bail, is that most of the hypotheses that are offered by other researchers and by people in the justice system, they are all around whether this disadvantages the defendant. So I briefly mentioned this kind of framing hypothesis, this idea that people might be perceived as either less human and thus less deserving of sympathy, or as a prisoner, making kind of prison the place that they should be. Through the audiovisual link, that's one reason why they may be less likely to be granted bail. Another reason is these issues with technical issues, where defendants may represent themselves more negatively due to the technical issues. These kind of clearly point towards disadvantage. So that's why we've kind of focused on disadvantage in this analysis. How have we gone about comparing people who appeared by audiovisual link and those that didn't? We were worried that if we just compared people who were seen by audiovisual link and people who weren't, that we would be kind of vulnerable to two sources of bias. Different types of people being seen by audiovisual link. So maybe people who are seen as more trouble to transport are more likely to be seen as audiovisual link, and they're less likely to be granted bail. Or people who opt to be seen by audiovisual link, maybe it's a kind of a different group. And then on the other hand, maybe different types of cases are seen by audiovisual link. So, you kind of save the more serious or complex cases to be seen in person, and then you kind of send the more kind of open and shut cases through by audiovisual link. To deal with those kinds of concerns, we've kind of narrowed our data set to just those who are being seen from either Amber, Laurel and Surrey Hills Correctional Centres, because we were told by people at those facilities through interviews that they had a pretty rigid process about determining who was seen by audiovisual link and who wasn't. So we're relying on this kind of rigid cutoff time as a way of deciding who is seen by audiovisual link and who isn't, to make sure that our comparison is kind of as good as random. If you want to see the technical details for this report, like I said, it's up on the website. Hopefully it's a fun weekend read. But the main things that I kind of need to tell you before we flip to the results is that I have gone about estimating the impact using 3 different methods. So you can kind of think of them as kind of like a more standard approach, a more kind of slightly more structured approach, and then the last one's kind of a more like unstructured kind of machine learning approach. The reason I've done that is because when you've got a decision as complex as the bail decision and you've got this much data, the way that you decide to estimate the effect can have a really big impact on what the result you get. I wanted to make sure that anybody looking at this could be assured that this wasn't me kind of cherry picking one result out of many, but showing that the results are kind of broadly consistent regardless of what approach you use. As you're about to see, it doesn't really make any difference. So I'll try and spend a little bit of time on this slide. This shows points to the right of that dotted line show that people are more the estimate shows that they're more likely to be granted when appearing via AVL versus being seen in person, while points to the left-hand side suggest that you're less likely to be granted bail when appearing via audiovisual link. So if we look at everybody, every hearing, every first bail hearing, and we estimate what advantage or disadvantage you might have from appearing via audiovisual link, 2 of the 3 models actually suggest that there is a very small advantage to be seen by audiovisual link. So certainly no disadvantage, or a 2.5% more likely to be granted by bail. While in this, using this kind of more structured model or this mixed effect model, you see that you're slightly less likely to be granted bail when appearing via audiovisual link. So our view is that this suggests that there's kind of no real evidence of disadvantage when appearing via audiovisual link when considering all the appearances in aggregate. If you turn to looking at Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal defendants separately, we see our results from that first slide essentially mirrored. The estimates are very close together for Aboriginal defendants and non-Aboriginal defendants, and we see no evidence that there's kind of a difference in the impact of audiovisual link for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal defendants. Here, I've split the results by their safer quartile or the index of economic advantage or disadvantage, where 1 is kind of the lowest level of economic advantage and 4 is the highest. And the thing that starts to show here is that there is some indication, I wouldn't say evidence, but there are these kind of small differences between the 2nd and 3rd quartiles and the 1st and last quartiles, which kind of suggests to me that there may be kind of regional differences in how the advantage audiovisual link or the disadvantage audiovisual link is working. So we see these kind of like mixed results here. It might be a little clearer to break it down by region. And you can see here that even though there's no meaningful or significant differences between categories of remoteness, you can see that there is starting to emerge some differences here where more remote areas, it looks like you're more likely to be granted bail when appearing via audiovisual link. To me, this kind of suggests more that remote areas may be using audiovisual link quite differently to those in major cities. After all, we're looking at defendants from Amber Laurel and Surrey Hills Correctional Centre, so there's much fewer defendants who are from remote regional areas. And what we see really here is that it looks like if there is an advantage, it's being created by some sort of selection into audiovisual link that is different for defendants who are who perhaps may be being seen in more remote regions. Finally, kind of to really hammer this home, I know this is very, very chaotic, but the main thing to take away here is that for looking at every offence separately, seeing if the impact of audiovisual link is concentrated among specific types of offences, we don't really see any offences where the points are kind of far off to the left, where there are kind of large disadvantages that are happening within specific offences. So even for the kind of the leftist most point, it's only kind of 8% difference, and these huge confidence intervals suggest that we have these kind of noisy and imprecise estimates. Here, what I'm trying to say is that we don't detect disadvantage for any offence, for even the kind of top 16 most common offences we have in the sample. So to bring it all together, the study doesn't provide any evidence that appearing via audiovisual link creates a disadvantage for defendants being granted bail. We see no differences at all in aggregate, and weak evidence for differences by region. And we're kind of heartened to see that we don't really think there's a disadvantage any larger than 8%, but there probably isn't even one that large either. We're kind of we kind of don't have a lot to say about how AVL is impacting defendants' experiences. So it could still be true that even though there is no disadvantage on the bail outcome, that defendants are still by and large not having a great time, and this could impact engagement with the justice system and other outcomes down the line. So, you know, I think that it's important to keep in mind that even though we find kind of an absence of evidence that's affecting the court outcome, that we don't need to then assume that, you know, this is working along those other vectors that I kind of outlined in the beginning. But we can say that appearing via audiovisual link will likely result in a net cost reduction, because there is this kind of large and sizable reduction in the transport cost, but there appears to be no changes in court outcomes, so we don't have to worry about, for example, kind of an offsetting increase in the remand population. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Min-Taec. That's great. I have a couple of questions coming in. How do your results match with those from other jurisdictions or even overseas that you've been able to see?
So one of the fascinating things about reading through this area of work is that there isn't a lot. There isn't a lot that has looked at this, despite the fact that audiovisual link has been rolled out across, across the world essentially. So there's a couple of studies that show pretty big impacts to the amount that you need to be seen on bail. But what you kind of consistently see is quite a lot of people who are worried about this effect, but not a lot of good research on it. So I would say that this research is essentially in line with most of the quantitative studies that have been done.
Great. Now we saw a weekly positive result for appearing by AVL. So there's not really any reason to think that it would be advantageous that you would appear via AVL. So do you think that possibly raises a question that there's something that we haven't captured in the study, or how can you account for that those weekly positive results for AVL?
Yeah, I suspect, especially given those regional differences, that there is some selection happening behind the scenes, that it is a slightly different cohort that are being seen by audiovisual link. It'd be fascinating to do some comparisons with the COVID cohort for that reason. But yeah, I suspect that what we're seeing is just there's a small group of people who are being seen via audiovisual link who are being selected to do so.
Okay, and there are some groups that weren't included in the study, so young people, and also we didn't look at the regional bail courts, regional weekend bail courts. Mm-hmm. Is there reasons for that, for excluding those groups, and do you have any sense about how the results might generalise to those groups?
So the reason that the sample has been selected the way it is it's the kind of the most consistent or coherent sample we could put together of the people we had data on, whether they were seen by audiovisual link or not. So in terms of why we stuck to adults, we only had a very small number of people in that kind of younger age range that were in our data set. So we thought it would be more consistent to just drop them from the analysis. And I believe that we did look at, don't hold me to this, but I'm pretty sure we looked at regional weekend bail courts and we found very similar results, but there were just not a lot of them.
Great. Do you think that can we say anything about how this finding would generalise to, say, sentence hearings or other hearings in the justice system other than bail hearings?
I'm hesitant to say so. I think the more I spoke to people about bail, it seems like it's kind of its own beast in terms of how people make decisions and the way that people are set up to make decisions in bail hearings. So yeah, I don't think that we can be too confident that this will generalize to kind of having no impact in other areas.
Great. And just last of all, Min-Taec, did the results surprise you? Did this go as you'd expected?
I was really surprised because there was a period in between getting the data and not, where I was just reading through the literature. I was pretty convinced that we would find, some disadvantage. So part of the reason you see that kind of battery of estimates that I've put it through is because I was suspected that there might be some disadvantage in there, and I would try to figure out whether it was something I was doing wrong that wasn't finding it.
Great. And last up, this is a tough one. I'll just read it verbatim. Is there any evidence looking at the relationship between AVL court appearances and recidivism? Increased possibility of stigmatizations suggests there might be.
Yeah, people are really worried about this one, and I hope we can follow up the study with that. I don't believe that there's any quantitative evidence on this, that solves this one way or the other, but I suspect we're about to see a wave of audiovisual link related research during this, because of this COVID period. So that's definitely going to be something I'm going to be keeping my eye out for.
The promised natural experiment of COVID-19. Well, I think we might leave it there. Thanks, Min-Taec. That generated a real lot of conversation. So for those in Sydney, this is like a social outing for you. I'm guessing it certainly is for me. I haven't seen this many people for a couple of weeks now. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. So we have one next last winter series in about a month. So that's looking at some positive impacts on reoffending for various prison or custodial interventions. So that's also going to be a ripper. And I really encourage you to join that conversation and tell your friends and your family, because there's no place that any of them would rather be, I'm sure, on a Thursday afternoon than listening to crime and justice seminars. So thanks for everyone for making time for us today, and we'll hope to see you again in a month. Thanks so much.